Lenses for Design is the title for this talk today, and I've used that because it is the title of a forthcoming book that I've been working on for some time now with the RIT Press, and it's a book that's perhaps a long time in coming for me as an academic and a professional. I've had both clients and students request that I put a lot of our experiences together onto paper in a way which would be useful to others. And of course, as a designer, I'm incredibly nitpicky about thinking about the best way to do that. So it's taken some time. But it's finally coming to fruition, and what I'd like to share with you today is not so much an excerpt or a clear sort of schematic for the book, but more of kind of impressions of the book, which I hope will be on shelves in a few short months. So a bit of context about me. My center of the universe is not far from here, in Rochester, New York. This, of course, is an important clarification for people who, when I say I'm from New York, they assume that I'm in New York City. I've not been there for that long. This is my 5th year in Rochester. I live in the Pittsford Village, which is a historic village just outside of Rochester, New York. Made possible by the Erie Canal, which was completed in 1825, linking New York City to Buffalo and the breadbasket of the country, and turning Rochester into an official sort of boom town. What I like to make note of, especially for people who've never been to Rochester, is that one of the great attractions for me and for many is the great beauty of the area. The Finger Lakes are just a gorgeous region. There's wine and all sorts of wonderful attributes there. The Adirondacks are close at hand. But at the same time, we're quite close to New York and to Toronto by air. I was in Philadelphia for about 15 years prior and loved living the urban life, but I now like to go into my backyard and enjoy the village life. Part of what makes that central dislocation, as I jokingly refer to it, strategic and interesting is that quick flight from those two urban areas, and that quick flight is made possible by the business sector in Rochester. Like Columbus, I think we have quite a number of interesting kind of blue chip companies that call it their home. The infamous Eastman Kodak, Wegmans, Bausch & Lomb, Xerox, Frontier, the University of Rochester's Medical Center, Paychex, Corning just down the street, and of course the Rochester Institute of Technology. I love this bird's eye view of RIT because it shows it as the sort of ovoid form with the heart being where we live in the College of Imaging Arts and Sciences and the School of Design, which I run the industrial design program. So you those of you who are here with the university or with the college, you have the advantage of an art and design school context. Ours, I like to think, is really an apples and oranges comparison. We live in a design school context which is wrapped by a university setting. And that, in our case, provides some interesting opportunities both for me as an academic, or rather an independent designer living within that academic framework, and of course for our students and collaborators. I want to talk to you tonight a little bit about my design process and products, but also about a holistic view of design. And part of that is thinking about how you organize your life as well as your work. So these are some shots of my studio where I do my professional work outside of my work in the academic context, and it just gives you some kind of visuals to attach to that. I like to think of myself as a humanist, and one who designs using humanist standards. The introduction to the book talks about this notion of finding simple, which, as many people have described, is probably one of the most complex things to find, and we'll get into that more shortly. History. I am the son of an archaeologist, and while that immediately conjures images of bullwhips and leather jackets and things of that nature, it's sort of the opposite in truth. I think that we think that's me with the baseball cap there, but nobody knows for sure. My father was a professor and did a lot of field work in the Middle East, and from a very early age, I think about the age of 6 or 7, I would accompany him on these excavations. Not glamorous in that Indiana Jones way at all. We would get up at 3:30 in the morning and bounce along a dirt path in an old Jeep to a work site where we would peel back layers of earth and sift it, and if we were lucky, we found shards of pottery. So, as I said, the opposite of the bullwhip and the cool hat. But amazingly, I found this work invigorating and fascinating, even as a young boy. I think the search for knowledge, the mystery of trying to assemble a picture of a bygone time, and doing so looking at objects and systems, was the core of it. So you can sort of draw a clear connection between that and my work as one who makes objects and systems. I don't come from a traditional design education background. When I went to college at Cornell as an undergrad, there was no industrial design, nor did I know anything about industrial design. My parents, nobody in my family knew about design. So I had no context, but I did know that I was quite interested in history and human behavior, and so anthropology was of great interest to me. And I had always drawn, I'd always made things, so fine arts seemed a fit. There was a 5-year program at that time, a dual degree, which I took advantage of. And somewhere along the way, I think actually I can pinpoint it in the junior year, I realized that taken together, the study of people and their behavior, and the study of materials, process, form giving, were something that people called design. And so I did come around to this idea of being a designer in a roundabout way. But I feel quite comfortable living in that space now, and the synergy of acting as a practitioner and a teacher, for me, has created this sort of tertiary moment, which encourages experimentation. And when people ask, why be an educator or why be a designer, for me, it's hard to separate those two, because they engender that third moment, which you wouldn't have if you were strictly in practice. It's a precious kind of piece that this formula creates. There's a story that I like to tell. It begins the first chapter of the book on kind of realizing my role as a designer when I was about 21 years old or so, finishing my undergraduate, not having a penny left in my pocket, sitting on the curb and watching a lumber truck roll by. I remember thinking that I wanted to make stuff, and I wanted to try to figure out a way to become a designer, to move on from being a fine artist and an anthropologist. And that truck that rolled by, all the lumber was the same length, and I thought, well, trees don't all grow to the same length. there must be some waste there that nobody's paying attention to. So I found my way to an old mill and asked them that question. They said, yeah, of course, that's the pile of, cutoffs that we don't use. Some of the guys take them home for butcher blocks or whatever, but you're welcome to that material if you want it. So I had this gold mine of hardwood logs, cut-off lengths, which I loaded up my Dodge Shadow with to the point where the tires were going to burst, and drove away. And I'd worked in all sorts of materials, but not much in hardwood. So I sort of taught myself how to respect this new material, and by necessity, meaning the lack of cash in my wallet, I was very, very thoughtful about how I treated that material. So the little doodle that I dug up shows me figuring out how to take all the wood out of this log, how to deconstruct it, how to excavate the interior, how to reuse all those parts, and then put them back together in this cabinet form. So there's something about the conversation around being resourceful and paying attention to material that was fundamental, I think, to my transition into working as a designer. I like to show this slide because, as I said, there's a piece about design as lifestyle, which is really important. Of course, I put family above all else, but my work as an academic and as a practitioner really exist on the same plane, and there's a synergy there in bringing professional practice into the classroom and bringing an academic's perspective to the business sector that I find quite valuable. And that goes right down to thinking about how one behaves to be productive. And I realized pretty quickly in my life, having kids and so on, that if I were to have 3 locations in my life where I had to be, that something would suffer in the mix. So I combined home and studio in order to make for a more synergistic lifestyle. So to start to get towards a discussion around some work, I believe that everything in our physical landscape is encoded. The stories of material and context are myriad in literally every object that we look at. And it's not just our job to embed meaning, it's our job to decode the complexities of what we see around us. And I think in many ways that gets at the crux of how we behave as designers. And to go back to this notion of sort of 3 ways of designing, these are really the ways that I see my work as working for clients in a traditional way, working for students in the academic pathway, and then working by experiment. And these 3 things truly, in my belief system, feed each other. So to think about this idea of lenses, perhaps it's that I live in Western New York, and going to Corning, you're confronted with the largest mirror for lens ever constructed. Bausch & Lomb is there. Maybe I was just bombarded with lenses for 5 years, and it occurred to me that that might be a good metaphor for a book. But I think that one can use this metaphor for seeing differently in design. And I'd like to walk you through a handful of lenses that I use in developing some of the projects I've made for industry. So cause and effect, this relationship that we think of in practical terms was a kind of lens that I used in a project early on in my professional career for a company called Umbra, which is a Canadian manufacturer of housewares. This was designed in the very late 1990s when we were on the verge of this little moment we call the digital revolution. And at that moment, I remember thinking about how our physical landscape was about to change so dramatically. We were just about to be able to implement all these things we'd been dreaming about, and what I knew was going to begin to go away were all those wonderful haptic moments in connecting and moving some of the interface pieces of products and systems. So I thought about making a light which kind of emanated from that discussion, and through a lot of trial and error ended up making this wall-mounted or tabletop piece called the Tone Knob. And I still love this piece because of its very direct kind of feedback loop identity. And it would be a lot easier to make this product in today's world, where you don't have to worry about the heat coming off of incandescent bulbs. But for me, the overall gesture withstands the test of time because of its obvious connection to interface. Exploring parameters, another thing that designers are so good at doing. This was a project for a company called Paris Business Products, which is a name that you probably wouldn't recognize, but it's on many of the products that you find for back to school and folders of various natures. This is a research into developing a clip and a system for binding papers. Essentially, when you put together a report to hand into your professors, you reach for something that you can add value to your report with. It's usually something plastic that has a little plastic spine on it to bind it all together. Ostensibly, it keeps the coffee stains off of it, but what it does for us as the people who grade those papers is adds to the landfill, because we take the spine off and we take the cover off and we throw it all in the recycling heap, because what we need to do is to fold it over. So we'll put a staple in it and then we'll redline things so that we can easily move through that document. So what I wanted to do is recreate that experience and make that easier for people. So essentially what this is a temporary staple, and there's a utility patent on it and so forth, which enables you to have that cover and be able to move papers if it's stapled. And I like to think there's a sensitivity in that small gesture. If you think about all the staples that go through shredders and wind up along with the paper and landfill and so on, it's impactful at the end of the day. So that takes the staple out of the equation. Ritual objects. I'm sure everybody recognizes what we're looking at on the left. On the right is a cuneiform tablet, or a not so great drawing of one on my part. The cuneiform tablet represents our first writing system, and for anyone who's actually seen a clay tablet, that came from the muck on the side of the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley many millennia ago, the piece that's interesting to talk about for me is that it's a piece of clay which is essentially formed to fit and feel good in the human hand, and that clay is impressed upon with a piece of reed to make markings that are interpretable as symbols and text. And the reason I put it up on the screen is that I think there's a fundamental sameness in our human scale and the limitations that come along with that in terms of what we can see, what we can interpret. So it's important, I think, especially as young designers, that we understand that as much as we emerge technologically, we are bound by our physical shells, and there are many things we can learn from that which has preceded us. So this is an interesting story, actually, because it turns out this company, AreaWare, that I made this menorah for, their parent company is based here in Columbus. They're called Harmony Ball. And I don't know if Lisa isn't here, is she? No, she said she couldn't make it, but I might see her later. Is there anybody here from Harmony Ball, by any chance?
I actually worked there for a little bit.
You did? All right. Cool. So you know Lisa?
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's great. So Harmony Ball's here in Columbus. I just made that connection yesterday, wrote to Lisa, and so I'm hoping that I'll see her later. In any case, you have this wonderful manufacturer that is parented here in Columbus. So what's interesting about this project from my perspective is that trying to work on a piece that is so deeply embedded with meaning, with history, is challenging, and I wanted to approach it with care and with tact. But for me, looking in the massive array of products that have been designed over the millennia, really, to do this job, I saw very few which treated this icon as a tool. It's usually treated as a religious artifact, and as we look at religious artifacts, we can see that often they're developed with precious materials for good reason. But as a designer, I had to ask myself, why is a precious material precious? Why is that? Why is it that we have to give diamonds as engagement rings? They're just rocks. So the thought was, what connotates precious? Why does it have to be that way? And I began the work of a kind of typographer in resculpting this icon and rethinking it from the ground up. One of the things that I discovered along the way was that most people, when they take a candelabra and burn candles on it, they put it on a plate to catch the drippings. And so I asked myself, why does the plate have to be a separate device? So conjoining the plate to the candelabra, believe it or not, was a legitimate innovation. And the millions of products designed in this spirit, this seems to be the first one of record that's done that. So I think it's possible sometimes to have insight when you have the courage to challenge all of the conventions that are embroiled in an object. Michael and I were just talking about this with fashion. Why are those buttons on the suit, and why are those lapels there? What do those things mean? And I think designers can be bold enough to ask those questions, even under in this case, I would say sensitive circumstances. But the Museum of National Jewish History called and took one for their collection, so I took that as an okay. Creative efficiencies, I think, is something that's really traditional for us designers to think about. This was a project which asked similar questions about many of the tools that bartenders employ to do their job. Kikkerland, who's an old collaborator of mine, based in New York, owned by a Dutch guy, asked me to look at barware, and so I was looking at lots of different jobs, and one that seemed like an obvious thing to address were the different measures that bartenders use to make complex drinks. And one of the chief concerns of bartenders were that the items they use get damaged. They need to use many different tools to essentially do the same job. So I was trying to figure out basically a way in which to distill as many of these measures as possible into the smallest footprint. So in the end, the cube jigger was developed based on kind of pushing and pulling volumes into the smallest possible package, and the idea really of pouring out of the corners came from sipping a sake box and realizing that it's possible to use a square format to pour liquid. That's been a very strong seller for Kikkerland. And in the same vein, looking at a very recent project that's just completed for Kikkerland at their request, they asked me to make a spoon set, which again felt on first glance as if, well, there are plenty of good spoon sets out there. Why make another? But on deeper examination, realized that looking at our behavior around using wooden spoons, that there could be some improvements to be made. Most notably, reducing out the number of spoons that we might have to have for most tasks in the kitchen, and that center one there comports with the inner curvature of most pots. So what you can do there, besides using it as a scraper or a spatula, you can also really get the sauce along the inside to stir properly. So this is, I think, it's not even for sale yet, but it should be in the next few weeks. And one of the challenges I enjoy the most as an industrial designer, I think, is really working carefully with the company to get all, not just the design as we think of it from a student standpoint, pieces right, but also get it right for the market. So we're working very closely with their biggest partner, which is Bed Bath & Beyond, to get the price just right, get the material just right, to target their users properly, and in the end, that's what defines a good product, is that synergy of form, function, and of course market. So I wanted to talk a little bit about a holistic approach to designing products. This was a really interesting challenge. The tugboat will make sense in a moment. I didn't design a tugboat. By the oldest manufacturer of adding machines in the U.S., which happened to be based just outside Philadelphia, called Monroe. And I got a call one day from the president of Monroe, and he said, basically, we like the cut of your jib, kid. So we sat down and had a lunch, and he said, come and take a look at our history and tell us why we're screwing things up. So I went in and looked at the archives, and they had this unbelievable, archive of hundreds, if not thousands, of machines dating back to the turn of the 20th century. I think as information designers, as graphic designers, as industrial designers, we can all appreciate the way in which they treated objects like this as extensions of basically the human body to perform functions. And what had happened from the late 1970s on is their business had sort of lost design as we know it in the mix, sort of like the way contemporary architecture in many cases has sort of devolved into a series of codes and other miserable things. And so we had a long discussion about their trajectory, and I actually consulted with them for a number of years before they asked me to design a adding machine for them. Before that, I had been encouraging them to stay away from adding new products, thinking that everything would sort of dissolve into a digital reality. But interestingly, from learning from them and from their users, the adding machine itself is still quite relevant to many, if not most, accountants. Actually, that image is sort of weird. I don't know what happened there on the right. It should be inversed. But at any rate, we talked about ultimately making what they called a concept calculator, like thinking of the analogy of the concept car. They wanted to rethink everything they had done and try to make a better machine. And so they twisted my arm. And what we did together, I'm quite proud of, because it's not something you would see in the design world, but it's out there, and accountants are very happy with it. It might pay homage to some of the wonderful Olivettis and so forth from the 1950s and 60s, but what I tried to do was to build this thing like a boat. So we reduced the parts count by almost 60%, internally and externally. We made it with a much more eco-friendly material, which was a challenge. We reduced out all sorts of interesting things by asking hard questions. For example, that paper roll, you can see that there's nothing holding the paper roll there. And in about, I think, every other machine I've ever seen, the paper roll has got a support system, a little bar that goes in there and keeps it so that it rolls properly. And so in observing these things, I said, well, if you make a molded tray, it should roll just as easily. You can eliminate that extra part, which it does. And when you make something in a plastic mold, you can do anything. It's not going to cost you more to add ribs so that it glides easily. So sometimes you really have to ask questions about everything in order to get answers which might have gone by the wayside sometimes for many, many years or forever. The other thing that I told them that they had to do with this product, not just redesign it from a logistics standpoint or from the standpoint of being more sustainable, but also to redesign the look, the feel, the way that it's communicated. So I told them, if you let me do this, if you want me to do this concept calculator, it has to be sort of for the people, and it has to reinterpret all of your mistakes. You have to give me carte blanche. I want to rethink your logo. I want to rethink your marketing. And they said, let's do it. So we redid the logo for the brand. We did the photography, everything, and right down to the manual, which was sort of a funny story. At the very end of the project, they said, oh, and there's the manual. Just as we were down to packaging and everything, they sort of gave me this ginormous Microsoft Word document that was just miserably designed. Nobody would ever want to read this thing. And I said, all right, I've got to take this and change it. And at the time, I wasn't doing a ton of graphic work, not like this. This is a graphic designer's dream job, but it wasn't mine at that moment. I just felt an obligation to deliver a clear and beautiful guide to this immensely complicated machine. So it took about 3 weeks to reinterpret all of the complicated language around this so that I could make a manual that people would actually want to refer to. So I'm quite proud of this. I went to some accounting product fairs with the company, and it was quite wonderful to see accountants loving this object and respecting the touch of the keys, which, believe it or not, is something that's very important to accountants. They have their affiliations like we do with different devices. Considering the void, something that designers also really like to do, to think about spaces to fill, things that haven't been thought of. This was a project commissioned by Design Philadelphia, which was a city event that I believe still goes on, probably in their 10th or 11th year by now, where DuPont Corian came in as a sponsor and said, we'd like to commission, I think there were 16 or 17 architects and me, to do benches using their material. And they wanted the benches to be what they called Philadelphia benches. And I thought, I bet nobody's going to do a Philadelphia bench. Nobody's going to make a cheesesteak bench. Every architect is going to make something really wild with Corian. And I was right. And there were some beautiful and whimsical and interesting and fascinating material studies. But I would wager that not one of them said anything about Philadelphia. And I kind of knew that somehow intuitively going in, that that's the way people were going to address this. And so from the get-go, not to be different, but to be sensitive to the brief, I really wanted to make something about Philadelphia. And that was a head-scratcher, because, of course, I didn't want to make the cheesesteak bench. But one thing that I noticed about Philadelphia in spending my time there was the wonderful stoop culture that's there. And it's not indigenous just to Philadelphia. There are other cities that have this, but it's definitely a Philadelphia thing where you sit on your stoop and you watch the world go by and you meet your neighbors and so on. And why is it so magnetic, this stoop culture? And so I started to really ask those questions and to look carefully at what happens in those conversations. And I think from a bird's eye view, you can see that benches are not conducive to conversation. It's hard for you to talk to you in this linear arrangement. It really only works for two. So what works in a stoop context is that people can talk to each other in multiple configurations. So pulling that stoop away from the architecture made for this kind of wonderful example of a different way of converging around a bench. And so Corian had a team of people that would build all these benches that we designed, and they really did an exquisite job. The detail on the right just shows how the material just is almost transcendent. It has this supple feel of like a Carrara marble. Really beautiful stuff. So we cited it in the least obvious kind of place, taking it away from anything that looked like a brownstone. And it was really wonderful to watch people interact there on it. There are lots of different relationships in the animal kingdom, parasitic relationships, mutual relationships. I think that it's an interesting lens to look through to think about product design. When Kickerland asked me, for a while they were asking for different products, can you make this for barware, can you do this for the kitchen? They asked me to make a fly swatter, and my first thought was, how do I improve upon a fly swatter? And then my second thought was, well, where is the fly swatter when you need it? It's never visible because it's an ugly tool, whether you're killing or you're just encouraging flies out the window. It's not a tool that you want to have handy because of that ugliness. So I thought, well, I could make a pretty fly swatter, but could I make a fly swatter that would, in its physical incarnation, encourage being visible? And so the addition of a magnet and the scale of that hook around domestic details, I think, provided for that set of opportunities. The playing with the hole sizes to make the fly pattern emerge was a result of Kickerland saying it needs something else. So there was another fly swatter that preceded this by Philippe Starck, the flamboyant French designer, and I had seen that, and at some point somebody gifted me with that, and it was the first time anybody had done anything with that sort of hole patterning, and like many of Starck's products, it was very clever, but it was meant to stand up, and when you put it on your desk, it would often fall over. And so I thought, well, that sort of defeats the purpose, and I'm sure he didn't design it to fall over, but somewhere in the mix that happens. So in a way, this was a sort of an homage to that, to say, let me take it to a different level, and like a jazz musician, call out a reference to that product. And what I should put in my slideshow here is that since then, there have been a whole bunch of fly swatters designed, which I've started to collect, which all have these different patterns on them. So I feel like I'm part of a dialogue in the design of those hole patterns, which is sort of funny. Another example of that kind of thinking was also done for AreaWare, the company that's got its parent company here in Columbus. This was a door stopper, which again takes the same approach, acknowledging that there's a lot of logistics that have been solved by existing door stoppers, but this provides a kind of affinity for its location, and it's sensitive to your interaction with the product. You avoid tripping on it and so forth. Midlife crisis of objects. I think a very interesting way of thinking about the way in which products degrade over time and how we address that. This was for a company that was based in Philadelphia called Beaux-Arts. It's an early project in my portfolio called the XOX table, and the goal was to design a product without any hardware. But what I learned or saw the opportunity for along the way in the manufacturing process was to try to be cognizant of the wear and tear that would occur over time with this product that comes apart and goes together, comes apart and goes together. So the material is actually MDF, and so what you're seeing in the edges there is just the raw MDF that's exposed. The surfaces are all lacquered, but by revealing that otherwise ugly material, which is often covered by other things, formica, laminate, and so on, you're creating the opportunity for that duress to be disguised by this kind of middle brown material. So what happens is the scratches, the duress that happens from the object hitting the ground and the walls, it's all camouflaged by that material. So there's a strategy in the way in which that detailing occurs that enables it to retain its freshness over time. Now, interestingly, as a sort of sidebar, that company went belly up, and all that research into RTA, or ready-to-assemble furniture, that I had done sort of reverted back to me. I had started a relationship with a company north of Venice in Italy called Casamania, and they were very interested in this RTA stuff that I was working on. And so we changed the scale and materials to approach a different sort of product for them, which, because the materials and process didn't need to camouflage those connections, but those since had gone into a larger scale production and have been quite successful for Casamania. And there's a sort of shot of a number of the projects in that family. So speaking of family, thinking about product design as a family affair is a different thing than making individual objects by commission, and we often do this as designers, where we're working on interrelated objects. This was a commission by a company out of Manhattan called Contextor, who were interested in products that centralized in the bathroom, but some of which were flexible in terms of their impact in the domestic environment. Really, one of the initial discussions around making tools for the bath were about how we organize things and where we keep them. This idea of circle versus square was seminal in the original discussions, because we were talking about plungers and toilet brushes and waste bins and so on, and I think the determination with form factors was important. We saw that when you have things which are rectilinear, they seek alignment, and if you can't easily align them in the bathroom, then they look bad, and if they look bad, they go away, and if they go away, they're not functional. So no matter how good your plunger is, if it doesn't look good and it's not available, like the fly swatter, you put it away, and when disaster happens, it's not there. So it's a kind of interesting line of thought when you start to go down that path. Again, a very unsexy product to work on, but fascinating if you strip away the conventions and the baggage. So once again, like the calculator, it was, for me, it was a case of reducing all the clutter, reducing the parts, and kind of thinking about materials which might make more sense. These are all made of a medical grade silicon, so that natural rubber plunger, which is going to degrade, is out of the question now, because it won't degrade. And there are no parts, there are no screws that get trapped in the plastic when you're thinking about recycling. And to be honest, there's no reason to recycle these products. They would last more or less forever. They're cleanable. There are no ridges for anything to get trapped in, and there are a bunch of sort of micro innovations in the detailing there that you don't really see. So anyway, these were kind of a big hit when they first emerged. A little bit more expensive than your average piece, but again, the goal being that these will last indefinitely. And there was an extension of products that I was also working on there that treated other areas. This looks at how you capture the roll of toilet paper, and for anyone who's struggled with taking the parts off and replacing the toilet paper, this is incredibly intuitive and easy with this little magnet. It just pops off and you replace it. You don't even have to insert it. The magnet grabs itself into position. And these other items that mount on the wall sort of collect miscellaneous things like newspapers or towels or whatever else. And the mirrors that we put together are along the same line of thinking, a kind of giant rubber band that capture the glass. So because of the incredibly high tear strength in silicon, the only thing that could go wrong with this product is that the glass could break and you could replace it, making, again, objects that could last indefinitely. So this is them in context, so you can sort of see how they might fit into an environment. A couple more examples, and then we'll wrap up towards the end. The power of suggestion, incredibly strong kind of lens to look through. You know, the objects that are, you know, embedded with ancillary meaning around us. This was a very early project in my portfolio for that company Beaux-Arts that I did the XOX table for originally. And this was sort of a, you know, scratching my head and looking at the shape of a bowling pin and thinking about that embedded language, you know, that something's implicit when it's down and something's implicit when it's up. So in the end, it's a lamp that was designed for children. And it's playful in that when it's over, it's off, and when it stands up, the light glows. Also rather complex because at the time it had to be incandescent technology, so you had to deal with heat and so on. But I like this image because there's something I think important in the designer's job that often gets overlooked. You know, designing that detail so that it's seamless, it's quiet, it's elegant, the way the cord enters and exits, and also the mechanism, which is something like a medicine cap, so that a parent can get in there but a child can't. And that's the responsibility of a designer to do, not just right but also elegantly. And so I think those are important details to show. The alchemical lens, Glass Lab is a fantastic phenomenon that the Corning Museum of Glass organized, and I'm like a convert to glass making in recent years. Glass Lab is an invitational project that Corning dreamed up, where they bring in architects and designers to do projects which engage in old glass blowing technology as rapid prototyping. And if you've ever blown glass, you know how magical it can be to realize and respond to the medium as it's happening, which is what we're not able yet to do with rapid prototyping in contemporary situation. So you go and you work with these master glass blowers, and you realize ideas. And so they invite you in with very little knowledge of the glass as a medium. And when I went in, I knew next to nothing, and used this as a forum to experiment with ideas which are not quite product ready. And I loved doing this in clear glass because it was almost like sketching in space. So this was one idea which had to do with capturing the cord that powers your cell phone, because that will often slip off the table. And since then, people have designed little nubs that go on your table to do just this. But at the time, I don't think there was anything really on the market like this. So there was that. There was the looking at how we could combine functionalities in the bathroom. And I was at that very moment working on the projects for Contextors. So this I thought was interesting, and I'm waiting for somebody to seize on this. They've designed these paper rolls, which you've probably seen, that don't have the tube in them. Maybe you've seen the commercial on television where we save millions of hectares of rainforest by eliminating the cardboard roll inside the toilet paper tube. And the thing that I noticed with those rolls of toilet paper is that you can pull material from the center, which sounds like a small thing, but if you think about it, it interrupts the whole landscape of architectural interface with toilet paper rolls. So nobody has designed product to engage in that yet. So go out there and do it and take the money and run. Because it makes good sense that you might want to rethink this ubiquitous object. It has new attributes as a result of this more sensitive approach to an environmental look at the product. So basically what this is a cap which allows you to thread the paper through the center and pull it out. It's protected from any moisture that would be in the environment by that cup that it sits in, and it just asks you to behave a little bit differently, which might be too much to ask. I don't know. So in the book, there are a number of case histories, and that gives you a deeper insight into the process that I've gone through in some of the projects. So I'm just going to show, I think, one example of that, which deals with what I call cultural resonance. And this was a project for a company called Casamania that I had done the RTA furniture for, and this was known as the SOS stool. And I think one of the nice things about the book is that in these case studies I'm able to sort of decode the process and share a timeline and try to delineate the differences between a designer's role and the company's role. So you may not be able to read all that from back there, but essentially breaks down the pathways that the company and the designer intersect with. And sharing some of the ideation and the observations about the things which come to bear on designing a product. This particular piece was commissioned. They asked me to do this stool to replace an existing rotationally molded polyethylene stool, which had ceased to sell well for them. So they knew that was a piece of their market they wanted to engage in, but they needed something new and fresh for that. So I began my research looking into relative products and also historic products. In the end, what I hoped to achieve was to extend the language of this product from a stool into a bit of a tray, and that was sort of the principal idea, that it could serve this dual function. And in my practice, I'm very you could say old school. I like to stick things together with spit, chewing gum, and duct tape, and test things a lot. I think that's still relevant and important. And the last thing I'll do is go to the CNC, but in this case, that's where we go when we're getting ready to tool up and make a major investment. So these are the molds in a small factory in northern Italy. And this is the final product. And I also get involved in these photo shoots and the messaging of the products, because I think that's quite important. And so speaking of messaging, a product life cycle, especially when you're dealing from the standpoint of being an independent designer in the dialogue, the life cycle includes the designer in many cases, and so I support the product. In this case, there was, as part of Design Philadelphia, we launched the project with DWR, and I gave a lecture and did an exhibition featuring the process behind the development. In the upper left is the release of the project, and the lower right at the Salone del Mobile in Milan of that year. And then the other two images show it in the Venice Biennale, where they had hundreds of them around the fairgrounds. It was really that was really interesting to observe the way people behaved with them, kind of in stealth mode. And that piece found itself going into a lot of different museum collections, some of which Michael mentioned earlier. And the reason that I share this is part of that cultural resonance lens, and sort of asking, why an object like this has a value in those sectors. And to sort of give you a glimpse at pulling things together, I think there's a convergence in all these lenses, which is maybe too much to try to decode or divulge in a discussion like this today, but that's the goal of the book, that really taken together, these things offer teaching tools and perspectives that could be relevant to designers and individuals that want to move ideas forward in humanistic ways. One of my students told me I had to have this slide because I'm so bad at social media, so that's all the social media stuff. I am there, just not very active in it. So, thank you very much. I hope we have time for questions because I love to take questions. Do we have any questions? Yeah.
I guess I didn't really know how your process starts. How do you start your process? Of building or getting inspiration and all that in order to make your product.
Sure. Well, it's certainly different every time because when I work with a new company or individual, it's always important to begin a strong relationship and to understand kind of where they're coming from and what their needs are. So while those relationships are as different as any relationship you might have with any individual, you might say that that's the research stage, right? So it always does start with that relationship building, which is research. It's understanding the whole set of realities that come to bear on what you're going to do for that company, right? So I know in design school, you get a brief, and it's all very clear because you have to answer this set of problems, and you know that you have limited time, so you bring your toolkit and you go through these phases. And there's some truth to that in the real world as well. But in I would say every relationship that I've been involved in industry, it's always been that first stage where we understand the landscape of possibilities together through that relationship building and that research. I think once we arrive at what we need to do together, and it might be as simple as them saying they need something specific, or it may be as complex as them saying we don't really know what we need, but we know that we think you can give us the answer. In the case of the calculator, it was a few years before we made a product. They just needed some insight. They needed somebody who had design thinking to bring to bear. But once those parameters are set up and that sort of initial research phase is complete, it's a lot of the usual stuff. It's trying to understand what materials and technologies are relevant to the discussion, and how to address those materials and technologies and how to purpose them towards the right ends, and then it's iterative testing, right? Which is what I tried to show a little bit in that last case history, that it's not just about sort of form studies. It's about making mock-ups and trying things, trying to understand how something fits or works or behaves right in context, and then once you have what I refer to as the big ugly sorted out, you can start to refine it towards an ultimate product language. Does that get at your question? Okay. Yeah.
What's your experience been from moving into publishing, moving into writing a book?
It's been hard. I think I have a really good friend who's a fabulous writer, has written a lot of books, and he would leave Philadelphia from time to time and go to this country house that they had where he had built out a shed where he'd go into the shed for 8 hours and work. And I used to think he was out of his mind. I mean, I would go into my studio and work for 8 hours, but it just seemed so poetic, and that he would go and do this thing, and I thought it just seemed abstract to me that it was possible that that's how he was productive. Now I totally understand that. Writing is a very, very solitary affair, and it's something that requires a lot of focus. And so I've learned that writing is a totally different animal. And I've done pieces of writing before, but they're short books, and short articles and things of that nature. But putting together a book which is trying to tell a story of a philosophy and an approach is a gut-wrenching affair. Stay away from it if you can. And it's, for me, and I'm just being transparent with you, for me, it's like many things in life, life becomes incredibly complicated, and it's not as simple as saying, here's the project, I'm going to do it. I started this book 7 or 8 years ago, as I said, at the request of students and colleagues and clients. And, I had a sabbatical from academia back then where I really dug into it, and I thought, for sure, I'm 80% done. I've been 80% done at so many junctures since then, and I started working. I had designed most of the layout of the book, and then everything changed, and I started working with a fantastic colleague of mine, this brilliant graphic designer called Bruce Meter at RIT, who's now responsible for much of what you're looking at. His ability as typographically is impeccable. I think I have so much respect for what he's brought to this document. And I joke, with my wife when I come home from my sessions with Bruce that the book's done again. So it's a living, breathing document that the writing is transformed many times, the hierarchy, the organization, everything has been in flux, and which is why I like to say that what you're seeing is a sort of impression of the book. It's been, now that it's with a press, it's been peer reviewed and all this stuff, and so I've been addressing these reviewers' comments, which have been really helpful because it's made it into a better thing. It's really, I view it like a good product design. Like I've learned to become a good writer and a good author, and to make a product which is holistic and I hope unified in itself. And I, at the risk of sounding like I sound every time I come back from my sessions with Bruce, it's almost done now. It truly is now because it's with the press and we have a lot of logistics in play. I do think that that will be done in the next few months. So that's kind of exciting. But to answer your question, it's been really hard because I thought it would be as easy as making a product, but it's totally different animal. Yeah.
Could you talk about color?
Sure.
Most of your products are very minimalistic, either black, white. There was in one, your spoons had like a touch of red.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly it's the material showing, so either wood or the silicone,
Yeah.
which is indicative of just design, like less is more. Just for sustainability, utility. But besides that, for instance, the counting machine,
Yeah.
the touch of green on
Yeah.
your black, it seems kind of. Could you touch on that? Like
Sure,
how you
sure,
choose
sure.
Color?
Yeah. I mean, I'm pretty strategic about my choices with color. With the adding machine, I really wanted to find the spirit of that object, and traditionally the readout has been blue or green because it's highly visible and communicative for a variety of material and technological reasons. And I thought that would speak to the contingent that uses this machine. And one of the innovations, sounds silly, but it was truly an innovation from the standpoint of their industry, was the size of that screen. Nobody had made anything that big, which I thought was great because if we could make it as big as possible, we could make it as universal as possible for users. So what I wanted to do was to call attention to certain aspects of the machine using that sort of iconic color. And I thought, well, this is a pretty bland object. Not everybody's going to look at it from my perspective and say, oh, that's a beautiful object in its simplicity. So in calling attention to that green screen, which you don't see when it's off, I wanted to bring attention to that little cap, which is really easy to change the paper on. So it's sort of like a signaling approach that says, interact with me and you'll be delighted to find out how easy it is to change this spool, because in every other machine we've tested, it's rather complicated and you need the manual to change that feature. So it's a signaling approach in that piece, for example. In others, I just my belief is that if you can make a product in a neutral color, if you can make it well, if you can design it well, and it exists and has an identity which is clear and useful and beautiful and functional in a neutral color, then certainly if you apply another palette to it, that it'll only be better. So rather than using color as a crutch, I'd prefer to go the other route. I favor this minimalist palette. That's my preference. But many of these products are issued in other colors that the manufacturer specifies, and they're usually sensitive to ask me about them. And those are fashion decisions, which I'll leave to companies to handle. I mean, I might have preferences, but it's sort of out of my hands when it comes to that fashion piece. I feel like, well, how can I can tell you that this holds 90% of all the cups that we've tested. I can tell you that that's a bigger screen and a better readout, and I know that color is going to read better. But when it comes to what people want in terms of a palette for those stools, I mean, you're going to have to decide, from a marketing standpoint, what you want to tackle and how you want to do that strategically. So I'll default to companies' expertise on that. And it depends on the relationship. With the stuff for context, or the silicon is really, really elegant in the way that it handles color. And I was very involved in the color decisions there. And I just didn't show a number of them. But in one case, we wanted to do a blue, and we wanted really to get the Yves Klein blue, which if you've seen that, is a really remarkable saturated sort of heavy blue. And we worked hard to get that. We got that, and that was a pretty strong seller for them. So yeah, I try to be strategic in my input on color and recognize my limitations. Does that get at your, yeah, okay.
So I'm in a class that we're learning about blue ocean strategy, finding those unexplored markets.
I'm sorry, do you say it?
Blue ocean strategy.
Okay.
So basically it's finding those unexplored markets and leveraging on them. So what's your process in first identifying like an unexplored market, like those toilet paper holders that you made that are just like innovative that no one ever thinks about?
That's a really good question. I mean, that's sort of why I'm, putting out these lenses, because there's so many different ways that I like to look for these kind of underexplored avenues. I think it's about carefully stripping away the baggage that we bring to every object, system, dialogue, and I think these are all methods for trying to see differently. I don't think there is a singular one, otherwise it would be called lens for design, and I would tell you the way to find the innovative approaches. So I really couldn't tell you in any simpler way that there is a way to find that opportunity. I think there are many methods that people have put forth, and these are to a large degree, kind of eccentric approaches that I've developed over the years. The book might be a useful tool for your discussion. Yes.
So it seemed like your process included like old school analog experimentation, but when you showed a picture of your studio, it was the most immaculate space I've ever seen. Is that like just part of your studio, or do you mess up that space?
It looks messier from time to time than that, but to be honest, that is kind of the way I like to work. So, it's I just believe in that principle of like the chance favors the prepared mind, and so I kind of apply that to my workspace too. I do clean everything up, and I do organize, just terribly, OCD about this stuff. make tons of lists. I catalog and archive all my process, and that's helped me to be productive, and that's the way that I work. That said, I mean, there are moments where we're messy and we're putting stuff together and taking it apart. I might have not taken the photograph at that moment, but it is true to life that I do keep things organized, and when things are a mess, I clean them up. It's partially by necessity. In this studio, when I was in Philly, I had a very large office, and it was also, maybe from everybody else's perspective, a big clean space, but there was stuff everywhere. A lot of my experiments and products and samples were all available. And when I moved to Rochester, we bought this house that we really liked, and at first I thought, well, I'm going to get a studio somewhere else. But then when I started to really think about my lifestyle and how I wanted to live and behave, I realized that would probably be detrimental, to have that third place to be in. And so short of really doing a major build and add on to the house, I thought, well, maybe I could work in this small studio area that we could sort of build out very compact, and I could take all of this stuff that's usually in my space and put it in storage. So I kind of designed this system for myself, which focused on an observation from my former productivity in the studio in Philly, which was that most of the real work took place on a table with 2 or 3 other people, and increasingly on computers, because, like showing that story of the SOS stool, we stuck together things and we tested little parts and pieces. In the end of the day, the samples came back from the factory, we marked them up, we sent them back, and we behaved more like that than, sitting in front of machines and, sculpting things and so on. So, to be honest, less and less of the hands-on approach is happening, and rather than sort of fight that, I thought, well, maybe I'll engage in that and sort of force myself to be even more organized about cleaning house when things pile up, and sort of keep that paradigm of the table, with the 4 of us working on computers and drawing and reviewing things and sending them back. And that's worked for me, and it might change. I sometimes think back to that big space in Philly and think, well, it would be nice to have everything out so that there could be a dialogue between objects and systems. But it's worked pretty well for me. The flip side is that I have my office at RIT, and we've got the shop there and so on. So from time to time I do things there. There's some bleed over there. I realize that it all looks very, very pristine in slides, but it's not that different in reality.
And you want your book to be a facade.